Thanks everyone, welcome to this Dissolve seminar. Sorry we had a little bit of a technical delay in the start, which is all to do with the world dominance of Microsoft, of course. Soon to be challenged, of course, by the high legacy. But it's a great pleasure to welcome David Uzzell, who will be familiar to many of you from the University of Surrey, and one of the founding fathers of environmental psychology. And his co-worker for some time, actually, Professor Nora Räthzel from the University of Umeå, who's a sociologist, so a combination of psychology and sociology here, and a quite long-standing project now where they've been looking in particular at the role of labour and the trade unions in the green debate. And so this is to report the findings of one of the earlier projects, and perhaps you'll probably both want to say something about the ongoing work as well in this area. Over to you.
Good. Okay. Thanks very much, Tim. The project has the very snappy title of Trade Unions Facing the Dual Challenge of Globalising Work Divisions and Globalising Environmental Degradation. And it's funded by one of the Swedish Research Councils, the Swedish Research Council for Work and Social Life. And it started about 3 years ago. Oh yeah, 3 years ago. And I'll come on to describe exactly what we're doing in a minute. But the reason why we've been looking at labour and trade unions is that while a lot of the work that I've been doing over the years, certainly in psychology, has focused on consumption, one has always been aware that consumption takes place within a framework, and it takes place within a framework of production. And that, if you like, that was the reasoning behind that led to, for example, Justin Spinney's work. It's still ongoing. I think the other thing that has intrigued us since we've started this work is that looking at the literature on the environment and sustainability, on climate change, one is struck by the fact that labour is rarely referenced. There's kind of discussion about the public or consumers, but labour and producers, other than, for example, producers at the level of manufacturers, rather than, say, the workforce, is rarely mentioned. And likewise, if you look at the labour literature, the environment is rarely mentioned. We've just come back from a conference in Leeds, Labour Process Theory Conference, and we were, out of, I don't know, there must have been 80 papers, 100 papers, we were the only people speaking about the environment. Climate change has not brushed up against those shores. And so what we are trying to do at the moment is, if you like, develop which we've got a kind of copyright on at the moment, environmental labour studies, which is this new discipline. And so what we're talking about really falls very much within that area. You're all expert on climate change. There's no really need to say much about climate change is happening. Even the oil companies were telling us this in 1962. Humble Oil, which became Exxon, which is today's Exxon, in 1962 boasted each day hydro supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tonnes of glacier. So you can't tell us that they don't deliver on their promises. And again, you'll be familiar with this from the IPCC, looking at what are the projected impacts of climate change. These are all fairly familiar to you: food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events. I'd just like to pick out 2 points from this. Firstly, climate change changes will not be gradual. It's not as if we've got an elongated window in which to act. We don't actually know when some of these really serious changes are going to kick in, because the change could be really quite sudden. There could be sudden tipping points. And there will be interaction effects as well. We tend to categorise these issues as if they are separate, but of course one will influence another. Increase in temperature, increase in rainfall will change species distribution, will change cropping patterns, which will lead to pests and diseases for crops, which will result in the need for pesticides and herbicides, which will then tie farmers into agrochemical companies, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so these things all work in an interactive way. These are, if you like, environmental categories. And when we've talked to trade unions about this and people working in the area of labour, they say, well, okay, what's it got to do with us? But as you can see, different groups of workers are implicated by changes in each of these areas. Whether you're talking about food, which could be agricultural workers, food processing workers, municipal workers dealing with floods, fishermen, forest workers dealing with ecosystems, emergency services, and so on and so forth. People are not just a generalised other. They are particular groups of people working in having different roles, different subject positions, and so on and so forth.
So our point of departure, one of the point of departures is the issue of the relationship between labor and nature. And I give you here a very long quote from the program of the first Socialist Workers' Party in Germany, which says, labor is the source of wealth and all culture, and since useful labor is possible only in society and through society, the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. Well, that sounds very good, and maybe most of us would agree to that. But already at the time, there was criticism of this by Marx, who said labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. And insofar as humans from the beginning behave toward nature, the primary source of all instruments and subjects of labor, as owners, treat her as belonging to them, their labor becomes the source of use values, therefore also of wealth. So from this, one should think that the labor movement would have from the beginning seen the issue of labor and the issue of nature, or the interests of workers and the interests of nature as related and inseparable. But as we know, history has developed in a different way, and taking into account the interests of labor, of workers, has meant for the majority of trade unions around the world to just forget this relationship and forget the issue of nature. So this is just something to bring into mind, that in the history of the socialist movement, that relationship was crucial at a certain point. So what does that mean for the relationship between globalization and global environmental change? We can see that, or we all know, I don't need to go into detail about that the relocation of work into the south is due to lower salaries there, is also due to the fact that there are looser environmental regulations, and that leads on the one hand to a precarization of labor in the north and in the south. I cannot go into detail how that happens, and it leads at the same time to the globalization of environmental degradation, because not only is climate change a global issue, as we know, but also with the relocation of work and industry to the south, also the environmental effects, the negative effects of those industries also become globalized. And two authors, Lashenko and Aubry, they have called this double exposure, and as we found, is one of the few books that take into account the relationship between those two globalizing processes of globalization. So how does one think about the relation between globalization and climate change? There is one position saying that this threat under which we all are creates a sense that we are a unified humanity exposed to the same threats, and that therefore that should enable us to form some kind of worldwide human solidarity. But the problem with this position is that it doesn't make a distinction between who is actually deciding about what kind of production processes are put where, and who are those who are the objects of these decisions. So one could say that what's happening in this position is a naturalization of society, because the inner contradictions within society are not accounted for. So then there is a second position criticizing that, which I've already mentioned more or less, talking about the different responsibilities and the power relations. However, one could say that that is a kind of societal reductionism, because these positions often do not take into account that nature is in fact a force in itself and has its own rules and regulations and fights back. And so maybe there is a way of thinking about these processes in looking at the relationship between labor and nature as inseparable and irreducible to each other. And maybe one needs to find other concepts, like some geographers, for instance, talk about social nature and try to integrate these two positions.
Okay, this is a two notes from Jacob Pat. What we've tried to do is, we've discussed climate change, globalisation, labour, and so on. Then how do these actually play themselves out on the world stage, if you like? I think this graphically illustrates very well. The top one is where the source of CO2 emissions largely coming from the global north, whereas down here we've got WHO estimates, WHO estimates, across health outcomes, malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea and inland flooding, fatalities. Most of the effects of this are in the global south, and I think that brings together the sort of north-south relationship in a very powerful way. So that starts to lead on to what we've been looking at in our project. We're arguing that climate change affects workers worldwide, but of course in very unequal ways. We've got transnational corporations moving to the south where environmental regulations are weaker, wage rates are lower, working conditions are poorer, and despite the fact that transnational corporations, as far as the workforce are concerned, represent a common, if you like, a common enemy or a common employer, these conditions simultaneously set workers against each other, workers in the north and south in competition with each other. Northern unions obviously want protection from cheap and environmentally unsustainable production coming from the south, and southern unions don't want to be the recipients of environmental degradation, the victims of environmental destruction caused by northern production and, of course, consumption. So the same conditions which create the necessity for cooperation on a global scale also create conflicting interests, power relationships, and therefore make global solidarity really quite difficult. So we have 4 research questions in this project. How do trade unions deal with the tensions between jobs and the environment on the one hand, and the north-south divide on the other? How do they see the connection between these two tensions? How do international, national and local trade unions cooperate to try and achieve a degree of solidarity across the north-south divide? And how do the views of trade unions differ depending upon their position within the different trade union, within the different organisations? These are the trade unions that we've been working with over the last couple of years. We've been working in Europe, Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, and if we don't run out of time, we're still hoping to do some work in India as well this year. We've been concentrating mainly on the metalworking unions, but also we've been talking to those some in the construction industry, forest industries, and others, but the main focus has been on the metalworkers. We've tended to talk to unions at the international level, whether we're talking about the federations, whether we're talking about the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the confederation of all federations and all unions, and that has about a membership, if you have about 167 million workers worldwide. We've then been working with the sectoral unions, so the sectoral international bodies like the International Metalworkers Federation, the European Metalworkers Federation, and then also at the national level as well, talking to the national trade unions, whether it's the TUC, whether it's Community or Unite in this country, or so on. And in terms of data collection, this is involved us going around talking to senior union policy makers, talking to them for about 2 hours, just as an in-depth interviews. And we've done, I suppose it's approaching something 40 of these interviews in all, I guess, 30 to 40. Yeah. Oh, bless you.
Okay, so first we can start to look at the specific strategies that trade unions develop when they want to put environmental issues on the agenda. And the white text you see, I'm not going to read it, those are quotes from the first international conference of trade unionists on environmental issues that took place only in 2006. So that was the first time they gathered worldwide to discuss environmental issues. And one way of getting the environmental agenda onto trade union policies is to link those issues with trade union concerns. And another strategy is to redefine the environmental agenda within trade union policy. So for instance, that a concern like health, occupational health, can be connected to environmental issues, and then the environmental issues and climate change become a health issue and can be dealt with by health officers. And what trade unions also tend to do is to broaden the vision of what unionism is, seeing as it not only as a movement within a factory for workers' rights, for pay, for salary, for working hours, but also looking at the broader society and connecting that with environmental issues. So saying that in order to have a society that is sustainable in terms of workers' interests and in terms of combating climate change, we need another kind of society that is democratic and ensures the rights, but also more democratic rights for workers and people in general, of course. So there are different areas in which trade unions work. One is education, and this is a very interesting example. This is Sustain Labor. It's an organization that is based in Spain, in Madrid, but is funded by the international trade union movement. So different trade unions from all over the world fund this institution, and they go around to different parts, mainly in the south, to not only educate people about climate change, trade unionists, but also to support workers in the south who actually have to deal with climate change issues, because that is what their workers are experiencing, and trying to support them in dealing with those issues as broader climate change issues, and not just as a bad weather condition that happens now and then. So to put their issues into a broader agenda. And a third point is research, information, dissemination. We have put three examples. Instituto Observatorio is an institute in Brazil. And it's quite interesting when we would ask people, well, what is the trade union, or which is the trade union in Europe that is most active in issues of climate change? They would say Comisiones Obreras in Spain, and that was quite surprising because people in Sweden would think it's a Swedish trade union, of course, we're best. And they have already in '95 founded an institute for health and environmental issues, doing research on it independently. I mean, it's a trade union organizations, but they have to get their money from the government or from somewhere else. And they are like the brain of the Spanish trade unions for their work on environmental issues, doing a lot of research. And the TUC has a labor research department, and they have done research in that area, but only in a limited way, I would say, because the research labor department has a much broader agenda, and from time to time they also deal with that issue. And in Brazil, you have an institute that analyzes the working conditions in different factories to see if they abide by the laws in terms of workers' health and safety, and they have taken in environmental issues, climate change issues lately. And there are, of course, also political interventions. This is just some examples of home pages where the trade unions have launched their environmental issue programs. But one has to see, and that is true for everything we say actually, that there is, of course, a gap between what is done in those institutions and what is done on the international and national level, and policy documents, and what then goes down to the workers in certain factories and is actually carried out practically. So there's quite a gap. But there is industrial action. You will all know this, especially that was the Vestas case, where there is a kind of simultaneity of workers' interests and environmental interests when a factory was closed down that was producing, I always say windmills. What is it again, the proper word?
Wind turbines.
Wind turbines, yes. And this is just, let me say one word. This is an example of a film that the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, put on, also a kind of education and promotion work in order to alert trade unions all over the world to the issue.
We fought for workplaces where the basic needs of workers were met.
We fought and won the struggle for the rights of women.
We have bring down apartheid in South Africa.
Sabemos enfrentarnos a los desafíos.
Y hoy la humanidad se enfrenta al desafío más grande de la historia.
Climate change.
El cambio climático.
El cambio climático amenaza nuestra existencia.
En el Amazonas estamos perdiendo los bosques.
In Africa, we're going hungry because of drought.
En el Caribe, el mar se está tragando nuestras tierras.
Climate change is everyone's problem.
التغيرات المناخية قضية جميع.
Klimatverandering gaat ons allemaal.
Climate change is everyone's problem.
We can and we will be part of the solution.
Join us. Únase a nos. Join us.
Únete.
That film was one of, I think it was 4 films produced by the ITUC just before Copenhagen. And I think it captures really quite well the idea that they were trying to bring, this whole notion of solidarity and trying to bring North and South together. They obviously tried to do that as well in the documents they had prepared for Copenhagen, and one of the key concepts that that they tried to get introduced into the discussions in Copenhagen was this notion of a just transition. And as defined there, a just transition is to create green and decent jobs, transform and improve traditional ones, and include democracy and social justice in environmental decision-making processes. And to consider the means for changing the way we produce, consume and interact, always on the basis of solidarity and mutual respect. It is within society and the workplace that genuine transformations must be operated. So what we've been trying to do in our research is to look at the strategies that have been employed by the trade unions to deal with the North-South divide, the way we've described the North-South divide, and the conflicts that arise from that, and indeed also to look at how those strategies have been seen by unions in the South. Okay, so first of all, if we just look at the issues surrounding the North-South divide. As I'm sure you can well imagine, producing a policy, this concept of just transition was not an easy process at all. It was a product of a consensus-striving process across the different sectors, whether you're talking about steel or agriculture or whatever, and across the North-South. But part of the function was to try and create, it was recognised that not all the unions would necessarily buy into every aspect of this, but it was about creating a space where differences and difficulties could be discussed. But it became quite clear, we went to one conference just before Copenhagen, and the difficulties that unions across the North-South divide face really came to the fore there. On the one hand, you had certainly unions from the South who were coming in with a much more radical anti-capitalist critique about the kind of policies that trade unions in the North were coming up with. So, in one document that was produced from South Africa, it said the intensification of the process of ecological imperialism, whereby clean production stays in the North and dirty production is moved to the South, is seen as a probable outcome of current frameworks to address climate change. So these unions in the South were seeing these kind of strategies as not really addressing the problem. The problem is capitalism. In the North, there was a different kind of criticism that was levelled by certainly one union. Some of you may have seen this before, where this was someone from the steel industry who said, green jobs are insulting, steel are brown jobs. You can't build windmills and aircraft without steel. The steel job is a green job. A rigger is a rigger when he's working in a brown or green job. What is a green boss? A green boss is still a boss. A green capitalist is still a capitalist. Okay. So again, a different kind of discourse, if you like, but very concerned, a kind of discourse which reflected a concern that we can address the problems of climate change through technological change. Okay. We can produce energy more efficiently, we can produce steel more efficiently, so therefore this won't affect jobs, which we'll come on to later. Another view that's commonly expressed is the one about solidarity, that the unions, when you talk to senior trade unionists in the North, they do talk about, well, we have to support our brothers in the South, we help them in all the ways that we can, but even when talking to one of these, this particular person had doubts. We have a lot of cooperation with trade unionists in the world. We help to organise, to build the trade union house. But we send essentially a member to explain what a good method is. And the method is the Occidental method. I'm sure that's not a good thing. And what the sort of subtext of this is that often support takes the form of sending out material goods. It might be a photocopier or something like that. Whereas if you actually talk to trade unionists in the South, they would say, the trouble is we're not sitting around the table. What we need is an airfare to come to the north and to actually participate in those discussions. So there is a kind of solidarity is confused in certain eyes with paternalism. Another strategy is about a number of unions, increasingly in this country, but certainly in the United States, with, for example, the Blue-Green Alliance, where there's been an alliance between environmental movements and trade union movements. How can they come together to come up with solutions to climate change? And a lot of the emphasis there has been very much on technology, making technological improvements, and getting the support of both the industry and the unions. But one of the problems with this, and again this came out of the meeting that we attended before COP, was that producing new technology is costly. There are issues over, for example, things like patents. The consequence of that is that, for example, if you're a steel maker, steel becomes more expensive to produce in the north. Firms won't obviously give their patents away to steel manufacturers in the south, so steel continues to be made in the south in very inefficient ways, highly polluting ways, and cheaper ways. And so therefore steel then gets imported, or has the potential to be imported into the north at a lower cost, and therefore this puts northern workers at risk in terms of being put out of work. And so some of them, certainly one, the United Steelworkers, were saying, well, yes, well we can support this differential, but ultimately there's got to be a level playing field. That I think the figure that the date they gave is that by 2020, steel production in the north and south has to be pretty much aligned in terms of its costs. Otherwise, they will be advocating to the US government that there should be border adjustments, basically a tax on imports. So, of course, this is interpreted by the north as not an act of environmental concern, as it were. You're concerned about the environment, but it's another name for protectionism. Campaigning for decent work in the south. Of course, a lot of, we're all aware of the kind of working conditions that go on in factories in Far East, shipbreaking and so on in India, Pakistan, and so on. And while the northern unions express concern about this, that presents a dilemma, it presents a problem. For unions in the south, that's the next one. That was the quote you nearly had. Okay. Unionists said to us, yes, for us, exploitation is better than starvation. If they don't work, they starve. And it's difficult to deal with that. And I said, I'm going to die quicker from having no job than from climate change. So again, there's a problematic issue. And then again, if you look at the ITUC report that was produced for Copenhagen, they talk about the need to protect the most vulnerable workers in the world, the workers in the south. But if you read through that, the workers really are constructed as, if you like, victims, not as we put it there, active agents of change, people that can try and change the production process. We have to do something for them. And of course this leads to a very unequal relationship again between North and South. It prevents solidarity. And I think one of the other things as well is that the unions in the South will maybe start to think then maybe we need to form other kinds of alliances and allegiances. This is the quote from the report. And so, as one said, and what was really interesting was that you had the Brazilian, Argentinian, South African, Indian unions saying, do you know what, we should actually really strengthen our South-South relations and develop union structures around this emerging basic group. And there are now, if you like, confederations of unions, if you like, federations of unions that deal with, for example, here the Small Island Developing States Network, who are now trying to work together to protect their collective interest as they have in common.
So the next example, do we have enough time? When we have to stop?
We do have to finish by 2, so...
Okay.
So there should be a discussion as well.
If you want to have a little bit of
So
discussion.
maybe we just skip
No,
that.
we have
to. We have only 10 minutes left. No. Well, let's skip. You see, was a lot there. You see the pictures. Okay. Skip this and we just go straight to the perspectives. So we have seen some of the contradictions and there were more that we haven't talked about. So the question is, what are the perspectives of this? And of course they're not easy to formulate, but we always like to present two perspectives that trade unionists and also researchers within the trade union movement or about trade union movement talk about. That is that in order to enable a trade union policy that takes environmental issues on the agenda, they have to overcome the split between workers in the workplace and, on the other hand, workers when they are citizens, consumers, and so on. So there has to be, if you like, a holistic view of workers being in the workplace as well as in society, which means that trade unions should, as some argue, go back to their roots when they used to be a social movement who was not just interested in what kind of working hours and salaries workers had, but was also interested in how society was constructed and how the life of workers existed beyond the factory wall. For instance, the Spanish trade union, and that might be one of the reasons why they are quite ahead in climate change issues, speak of themselves as having 2 legs. One is in the factory, and the other is outside in society, where they take care or fight for issues like education, the health system, because they say that affects workers as well, and not just their situation in the workplace. So this is the idea of trade unions becoming, again, as some say, a social movement. And then there is this quote from this one person of the ETUC who had quite a broad perspective, saying sustainable development is a possibility to build a new project for humanity, because nobody knows what a sustainable society should look like. So each trade union in the world, each person in the world, each population in the world has the possibility to express their views and their opinion in order to build this project. It's very important to have a real cooperation with other countries and to take into account their demands and not to represent only the arrogance of colonialists. So that was a French person saying that. So it's the idea, and some people in those trade unions are really trying to struggle and fight for that, that one has to kind of step back and rethink not only the way in which our society is structured, but a way in which society and humanity and the power relations are structured as such, and try to form a kind of solidarity where everybody has to change their views and their positions. Shall we talk about the... So, okay, 1 minute for the perspective that what came out of this project is that we're going to do a book where we gather those few people in the world who are actually working on the issue of trade unions and climate change, and that will be published by EarthScan, hopefully in the beginning of next year. And 2 other research projects have come out of this project. One is an EU project with 7 different countries, where we look at the ways in which companies could change their production processes and their workplaces in a way that they create less emissions. And the other research project is a long-term 5-year project where we look at individuals as change agents in organizations, and we take trade unions and their environmental issue as example, because what we found in this project is that when trade unionists have passion about environmental issues and want to insert that agenda into the trade unions, they also have to change other parts of the union. They have to change the way in which unions work more generally. And the question is, what kind of relationship exists then between those active individuals, especially in times where trade unions all over the world have to reinvent themselves, giving the many reasons why their membership and influence is going down. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry we're a bit squeezed. There's a class coming in afterwards, and we had a technical problem before. So we've got a little bit of time though, 5 minutes or so for questions. So I'm kind of fascinated by your idea, the one you set out quite early on, that somehow labour and nature together represent a compromise between, or not necessarily a compromise, but a happy outcome between the two rather polarised positions. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. I suppose it's encoded a little bit in your happy marriage or marriage of convenience. Is your sense of what's happening here a real negotiation within the labour movement of an idea about sustainability? Or is it, do you think, a marriage of convenience in the more pragmatic sense?
Yeah, we think that it is different in different countries and for different unions, because one thing that we could see is that really those trade unions that see themselves more in terms of social movements, because they came out historically quite recently out of struggles against dictatorships like in Spain and Brazil, that they tend to work together, especially in the South actually, as one might not expect it, with environmental movements. And at the same time, environmental movements, because they need to take into account, for instance in Brazil and South Africa, that there is poverty and that people need work. So they couldn't be that blind to labor issues like some environmental movements in the North that just thought, okay, you know, trade unions are just egocentric, fighting for their jobs. So what we can see is that in Europe and especially in the South, there is a movement towards each other. There is a movement of trade unions starting to see environmental issue as serious, and there is a movement of environmental movements starting to see that jobs are also important. I mean, you will know that Greenpeace has produced this big paper about green jobs, you know, and how we can replace green jobs. So there's this whole green job issue. But then there is, of course, another position coming from researchers and from trade unionists saying that this green job movement can also become, or is in danger of becoming, quite technocratic, where it's just about changing some technology, and that actually what has to be done is to address the issue of capitalism, the issue of power relations, the issue of control of production through social forces, trade unions, environmental movements, the state, and so on. So there is a discussion going on, but in which direction? Who's going to win? If it will be a happy marriage or a marriage of convenience, you cannot really predict it, because in fact it's just started perhaps 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, Scott.
Thank you. Have you observed any kind of significant differences between attitudes towards the environment within public sector trade unions versus private sector trade unions? Is that a significant variable at all?
We'll be able to answer that question in about 2 years' time, I think, because that's actually one of the things that we'll be looking at on the EU project. We're looking at, if you like, 3 classes of production. There's public sector, light industry, and heavy industry. And so Nora and I are working on the heavy industry section, looking at Volvo and hopefully Shell. But 2 of the other research teams are looking at the public sector. In terms of this research, I think we did interview some trade unionists in Malaysia who were in. There was 1 or 2 in the public sector there, but I really would be very hesitant about saying that there's a significant difference. But I don't think we've not really looked at it sufficiently to draw any kind of conclusion like that.
I mean, the differences you see is in terms of how are climate change policies going to affect certain jobs. And there you find differences between the different trade unions depending on whom they represent. And their public work is often they're going to benefit from climate change measures, so they're more positive.
I'm sorry I missed the first half of this because it sounded very interesting, but I've gone towards something else. A suggestion. If you go back to the G7 meeting in Seattle 12 years ago, whatever it was, I know quite a lot about that from the other side because my daughter, my feral daughter, was one of the rather successful organisers who disrupted it. And one of the things which happened in the background and really didn't get publicised at the time was that there was a lot of discourse between the activists, like my daughter, mostly with Earth First, and the labour unions, particularly in the forest products industry. And she was very surprised by this because normally they regarded each other as the enemy. And they realised in the course of what was going on in disrupting this meeting that they actually had common interests. Now, I'm not clear whether anything, I'm going to ask her, I'm not clear whether anything really built on that, but it strikes me it's a bit like some of the agenda you're talking about here, but it's a northern example of it, particularly west coast of Canada and the States.
Well, I think there's something behind that in terms of the Blue-Green Alliance.
Yeah.
Very much like that.
Yeah, that's also one of the reasons why we talk with construction workers, because they're wood and construction workers. And in fact, forestry and forest work can go in both directions to actually extract the forest at the maximum, just for profit reasons, but also to preserve it. And so in wood and forestry, there are actually strong tendencies.
Oh, that's right.
Take the climate change agenda.
This was one of the first occasions when the forest products unions realised that actually clear cutting is a stupid thing to do.
Yes.
And that was something of a breakthrough.
Yes.
And that came out of our interviews that we did in Malaysia as well, where in terms of the forestry unions there, it's about the importation of labour from overseas at cheap rates to work in the forest.
Yeah.
But it's also not being sensitive to the environmental conditions locally, which they recognise there's a need to be in. It's going to have sustainable forest.
Just on that point, I mean, what Seattle was basically was fundamentally anti-capitalist. It was anti-globalisation and anti-capitalism. Just going back to your first point about Marx and that critique, I mean, I wonder, there's an obvious sense in which labour and environmentalism might move together because if the common enemy is seen to be capital. Mm-hmm. But actually, if you think about the way in which, in the Marx critique, capital undermines labour and undermines nature, they're not symmetrical. They're not in the same relationship to each other. So capital undermines the interests of labour because labour is a cost to capital. Nature can be perceived as a cost to capital, but it's also a vital resource to it. And so and actually there's no one representing the interest of nature in the way that labour represents its own interests against capital. So those sort of asymmetries are kind of fascinating.
Precisely, and that's also what he discusses later in this critique of the program, that there is actually a bourgeois interest, as he calls it, in separating labour and nature in that way, because nature is privately owned.
Yeah.
And those who own nature have the power to decide what to do with it. And those who only own their labour force, they are dependent on the owners of nature and the conditions. So in a way, one could say that if the labour movement kind of disregards this aspect, they kind of reproduce those power relations that they are opposed to on the one hand.
Which
so
is the point of your last quote from the Night SD quote.
Yes, precisely.
Very good. I think we probably will have to call it a day there because I think we're trying to get in and Matt's starting this course. But thank you both very much, absolutely fascinating. We look forward to what's going to come from it in the next few years. Thanks.